This is Dilemma. I'm Jay Shapiro, and this is some ideas I want to spill into the camera. I'm toying around with this format a little bit. I do essays and interviews on the show, obviously, but I'm toying around with some sort of off-the-cuff, unscripted things that are on my mind in shorter form like this. So this one, I've been thinking a lot about the notion of authoritarianism lately. And I mean authoritarianism as sort of an existential orientation, rather than some sort of, specific political structure or something like that. I want to talk about distinguishing authoritarianism from humanism as maybe also a way to introduce you to how I think about a lot of these problems and maybe some conversations I have coming up. So, authoritarianism. If I were to describe to you a system or an entity or a force or something like that you couldn't really quite understand. It was sort of a black box that was too complex to understand, or maybe it had secrets that you just couldn't know or you couldn't comprehend. But you had to trust, or you did trust, that this thing had your best interest in mind, and maybe everybody's best interest in mind. It was sort of a benevolent system. I think that's pretty easy to understand in a lot of contexts of religious authorities that we have come to know or think of forms of gods that you have to trust, especially in the Abrahamic religions, that kind of ultimate faith, even when you don't know the plan or you can't even decipher the plan or the plan doesn't even look loving to you, you have to trust that it is. And that's celebrated as a virtue. That's certainly a form of familiar authoritarian orientation. But people who reject the metaphysics of God for whatever reason are fully susceptible to authoritarian thinking of other types, which has the same flavor. So if I told you that a system that had to keep some secrets from you, you couldn't know the whole truth, it really worked in ways that were a little mysterious to you, but you had to trust it, and you generally trusted that it had your best interest in mind to a significant degree, even if it sort of had to lie to you or keep certain things from you or shield things from you. That's a form of state worship that I think is incredibly common and popular. And then I think the libertarian answer to some of that, which clearly dislikes the state worship and control, if they reject the metaphysics as well, is a kind of worship of the market, where you trust the market and the invisible hand of the market to sort of work everything out and sort of maximize our self-interest, and it will somehow be some sort of reflection and emergent system that gives rise to a world that's a kind of best case scenario compromise of everybody's best interest and will self-correct in certain ways. And we have to trust that that's kind of happening. I think that, even though it sounds a little different, is yet another form of authoritarian sort of outsourcing of an ability of us to step into that system and craft it or enter it in a different way. Of course, there's other forms of authoritarianism that are, just apparent in your head, in your mind, maybe your whole life. A teacher, conformity, obviously, the norms of your society. All of these things, I think, are authoritarian orientations. And before I get to sort of the obvious answer, and I think antidote for this, or at least target for this, which is humanism, I think authoritarianism has this really ugly feeling to the word, but it's incredibly common. I once wrote an essay, it's on my site somewhere, called "It's the Implications We Fear," which I think is really that almost all of the time when we're thinking about something, we're jumping towards the, if I accept this proposition or I face this reality, then it means this, and I'm afraid of that, so I will deny the proposition itself. And so what I'm really getting at here is, without any authority, I think we are terrified of what Erich Fromm, and I might read from him here, I have a book that he wrote, one of my favorite thinkers, Erich Fromm wrote The Escape from Freedom. What we're terrified of is the state of existential freedom and moral ambiguity. This is something Simone de Beauvoir wrote about, who I mentioned in another essay. I think that is really what we're afraid of. We're afraid that nobody's at the wheel, that God doesn't exist, that the state doesn't have our best interest in mind. The market might not be reflecting our best selves and that we could do better. But who are we to step into this world? Obviously, there's stories like Icarus flying too close to the sun, or even in the Garden of Eden, eating from the forbidden fruit, which can be interpreted in very much a humanistic way or an authoritarian way, that it was the original sin, and Fromm writes about that a lot as well, is a warning that you sort of need this authoritarianism. Jordan Peterson probably is in this camp, whether or not he really believes the proposition of a godly authority. He certainly thinks you need something. And so my answer is, and actually before I get to that, this was also sort of prompted, this off-the-cuff kind of idea spill, by a email that I'm going to be hosting. I did this for them before too. They're really fun. I'm going to be hosting some panels at the How the Light Gets In festival up in London in September. And one of them sounds really cool, on mysticism versus modernity. I won't read the whole prompt, but the end is a question that says, should we conclude that we all have to worship somebody or something, whether it be gods, leaders, or principles? Anyway, it's going to be really fun. If you happen to be up in London for How the Light Gets In, I'll be hosting that panel and maybe one or two others, so find me there. But maybe this is kind of my answer to it, that if I'm saying there's God worship, state worship, maybe parent worship, maybe authority worship, maybe just credentialism worship, or maybe it's even just natural worship, right? There's sort of a naturalistic fallacy that you trust the universe itself, nature itself, to be in charge. And even if it's not benevolent, at least maybe it's amoral, right? A lot of the hard determinist anti-free will crowd falls in this camp, where the entire universe, including ourselves, is just a physical system that somehow is giving rise to my conscious experience, but it's completely contingent upon it, whereas there's no free will. I can't step into it. The universe will do what it's going to do, and it casts me as just a witness of the universe rather than an author of it. I think all of that's sort of a philosophical way to commit the naturalistic fallacy, in my view. But even that, if it's the universe will do what it's going to do and we just have to watch, is maybe an amoral authority, but it still erases what humanism insists ought to be, at least the effort, the orientation of injecting into the universe. So humanism, right? So I recently spoke to Scott Horton, who's a hardcore libertarian, and I think he would fall maybe in more of the anarcho-capitalist realm of this, and maybe be guilty of some of that market worship, in my view, where I'm saying the anarcho-humanism is something like, and you can argue I'm answering the question here, that the human is sacred. Maybe I'm elevating the human to be sacred, or maybe I'm just recognizing or insisting or arguing of the sacred potential of man, of human, and that should be our orientation, our quest, our profession of man, as it were, is to try to unfold the sacred potential of ourselves, to transcend nature, to shape it, to become gods, as it were. This, of course, is the original sin of Icarus and all of these kinds of things. But in some ways, it almost casts the God question to the side as unimportant, whether or not he or she is real or whatever, is that we insist that we are capable of being our own authority, a moral authority, by grappling with these questions, by entering into the world in such a way. And that's how I think, and that's how I am. And whether or not that holds up scientifically or even philosophically to the sort of anti-free will crowd, I don't really care. It's the orientation that I'm interested in. And I was going to read from Fromm's book here, but it's kind of a longer passage. But I think what's important to actually note, maybe I'll read a little bit of it, is that when I'm saying authoritarianism and humanism, they're best thought of as sort of adjectives, orientations, kind of ways of being that you can slide in and out of at different parts of your life. Obviously, I would advocate for humanism over authoritarianism. But even in the same religious traditions, he actually grew up studying the Talmud and all that before he was interested in other things. So he has stories of, in the Old Testament, of, God at the beginning is a very authoritarian figure, and his relationship with man changes, and he argues changes drastically after the flood. But to give you a story that he thinks illustrates kind of a humanistic trend within Talmudic teaching, there's this story that he shares, and then there's one from Christianity I'll read as well. So it's a bunch of rabbis gathered around in this room trying to argue about sort of God's mind or the moral nature of the universe and what the right thing is to do, and God's kind of watching it. So the story goes like this. He says, a number of older famous rabbinical scholars disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's views in regard to a point of ritual law. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is what I think it is, then this tree shall let us know. Whereupon the tree jumped from its place 100 yards. Others say 400 yards. His colleague said to him, one does not prove anything from a tree jumping. He said, if I am right, then this brook shall let us know. Whereupon the brook ran upstream. His colleague said to him, one does not prove anything from a brook running upstream. He continued and said, if the law is what I think it is, then the walls of this house will fall. Whereupon the walls began to fall, but Rabbi Joshua shouted at the walls and said, if scholars argue a point of law, what business here have you to fall? So the walls fell no further out of respect for Rabbi Joshua, but out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, did not straighten up. And that is the way they still are, these half-fallen walls. Rabbi Eliezer took up the argument again and said, if the law is what I think it is, they shall tell us from heaven. Whereupon a voice from heaven said, what have you against Rabbi Eliezer? Because the law is as he says. Whereupon Rabbi Joshua got up and said, it is written in the Bible, the law is not in heaven. What does this mean? According to Rabbi Jimerjahu, it means since the Torah has been given on Mount Sinai, we no longer pay attention to voices from heaven because it's written. You make your decision according to the majority opinion. It then happened that Rabbi Nathan met the prophet Elijah, who had taken a stroll on the earth, and he asked the prophet, what did God himself say when we had this discussion? The prophet answered, God smiled and said, my children have won. My children have won. So the story in that regard is kind of that God is sort of not an authority even over the men arguing about what's right or wrong or what the law really says, and God is happy about it. He says, the story is hardly in need of comment and emphasizes the autonomy of man's reason with which even the supernatural voices from heaven cannot interfere. God smiles. Man has done what God wanted him to do. He has become his own master, capable and resolved to make his decisions by himself according to the rational democratic methods. That's a humanistic story that he finds within the Talmud. He finds very authoritarian stories in early Judaism as well. And he finds kind of the same pattern in Christianity. I'll read a little bit of this as well here because it's a similar thing. The early Christianity is humanistic. Maybe this is reversed. The early Christianity is humanistic and not authoritarian, is evident from the spirit and text of all of Jesus' teachings. Jesus' precept that the kingdom of God is within you is a simple and clear expression of non-authoritarian thinking. But only a few hundred years later, after Christianity had ceased to be the religion of the poor and humble peasants, artisans and slaves, and had become the religion of those ruling the Roman Empire, the authoritarian trend in Christianity became dominant. Even so, the conflict between the authoritarian and humanistic principles in Christianity never ceased. It was the conflict between Augustine and Pelagius, between the Catholic Church and the many heretic groups, and between various sects within Protestantism. The humanistic, democratic element was never subdued in Christian or in Jewish history, and this element found one of its most potent expressions in the mystic thinking within both religions. The mystics have been deeply imbued with the experience of man's strength, his likeness to God, and with the idea that God needs man as much as man needs God. They have understood the sentence that man is created in the image of God to mean the fundamental identity of God and man. Not fear and submission, but love and assertion of one's own powers are the basis of mystical experience. God is not a symbol of power over man, but of man's own powers. And I think he goes on. Fromm is great. If you've never read any, grab a Fromm book. You won't be disappointed. But I think that were the trend, a humanistic trend or authoritarian trend, are really good ways to think about this. So I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been noticing it everywhere. On a personal level, I think you start to notice trends within yourself, humanistic and authoritarian trends of, and the goal, of course, I would argue for, is humanism, is to recognize and step in with a degree of confidence of that we can do this, that we can live, that we can exist within moral ambiguity and try to wrestle with existence itself. There's no sense in fighting God. God is sort of beside the point, as is sort of an authoritarian state. This is also in the political realm why I think it's so important in some ways, and this is more delicate, to distinguish anarcho-capitalism, which I think is equivalent to kind of the Scott Horton libertarianism, versus anarcho-humanism, which is just an emphasis. It might look similar in certain ways, but is an emphasis not on sidestepping or outsourcing moral questions to something amoral like the market, or something authoritarian like the state, or of an authoritarian God, but having the courage to step into these questions ourselves. Now, that orientation, my orientation there, I think puts me probably at odds with, I think I've seen some of the Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and other conversations where they might reach this point mentally and then immediately elevate sort of their answer to the moral question to be God, and that's sort of the end of their line. Certainly, that puts us at odds there. That's the move I wish people didn't make, that we could embrace the I think challenge of humanism. What I'm arguing for is what we have here, what we already are, the potential we have is to make beauty, is to actually not, end the world in destruction, but make beauty, make love, discover and discuss and invent or craft morality that we feel is worthy of ourselves. So that's the goal, I think, of humanism, and it's difficult. I'm not saying any of that was easy, but it's something I've been thinking about. All right, so that was an idea spill. Like I said, I'm playing around with this format as well, but I normally do essays and interviews, and I have a bunch of good ones coming up, so please do subscribe. Here's who's coming up: Radhika Desai, Patrick Bond, Coleman Hughes, which should be a really interesting one. We're talking about Palestine. He's my former co-host. Adam Hanier, Paul J., who made a documentary, if you want some homework, called Wrestling with Shadows, about Bret Hart, that you have to watch. I'll remind you again, it's one of my favorite films ever, so you have to watch that. Hamid Dabashi, Dirk Moses is going to come back on, Nandita Sharma. So I have a ton of amazing guests coming up on politics, philosophy. We're going to talk a lot about the changing global world order. Maybe I'll bring in some of this authoritarian existentialism to talk about as well. So please do subscribe. Did I say describe? I want you to subscribe and like, and thanks. Should I leave that? Where did I say describe? Describe.